Hello and welcome to Learn with Avthar, the podcast that helps you become a learning machine. I'm your host Avthar Suratan, and what you're about to hear is a conversation between myself and Jordan Thomas. Jordan hails from Newark, New Jersey in the USA, and he's one of the most accomplished young people that I know. He graduated Princeton University with a degree in public policy and international affairs. He's a Rhodes Scholar and earned his master's degree from Oxford University in social intervention and policy evaluation. He's currently the chief of staff to philanthropist Ray Chambers and will enroll in both Yale Law School and Harvard Business School for a unique JD MBA dual degree. Jordan is motivated to do work that most directly promotes social mobility, equal opportunity, and justice for all. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably the sort of person who loves to learn new things every day. And I've got good news for you. There's tons of learnings from Jordan's episode. We talk about Jordan's journey from engineering to policy and how he found his strengths and developed self-awareness. We discuss why Jordan believes waking up early is a core habit which fueled his success and how he developed grit and resilience and wants to take David Goggins' soul. We also discuss why focusing on helping others is Jordan's secret to his success, and tons of practical tips for young people, budding entrepreneurs, and just people trying to live their best life, like the application writing techniques that got Jordan into Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and Oxford, and the books and speeches that's most impacted Jordan's life. I guarantee you'll leave this episode motivated and ready to conquer the world. Now, if you enjoy Learn with Avthar, be sure to subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, or simply connect with me through my weekly newsletter. It's an email where you'll discover one thing each week that can change your life. You can find it at avthar.com. That's avthar.com. I hope you have a notebook ready or the Notes app on your phone because you're going to need it for all the gems of knowledge that Jordan drops in this episode. Please enjoy my conversation with Newark's finest, Jordan Thomas. So first of all, thank you so much, Jordan, for coming onto the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you about your time at Princeton, your experience as a Rhodes Scholar, and the work that you're doing now under Ray Chambers and under the venture capitalist John Simon as well. And just to unpack a lot of the way that you think about the world, and also for our listeners, compare and contrast the various paths that we've taken in life, myself with technology and entrepreneurship and business, and yourself with more of the public sector and how the public and private sector can work together. And so I'm really interested to dig into all of those things. Thank you so much again for coming onto the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's really an honor. And immediately when you invited me, I was just overjoyed because we've known each other for quite a while. So I know that everything that you touch really is gold. You put your heart and your soul into it, and it's always of the utmost quality. But also just reviewing some of the content that you have online. This is wonderful stuff. The tips that you share with people, the depth of insight that you actually just so freely dispense via your newsletter, just posting online and the blog post styles that you have or on this podcast. It's immense amounts of really tangible, high quality information. So to the extent that I can contribute a bit, I'm more than happy to.
I really appreciate that. Everything that I try and do is through the lens of service and through the lens of helping people, and not saying that I have all the answers, but this is just my experience and what I hope is going to be useful and help people in life. And I know that from this episode, I can already tell from the stuff that we're going to talk about, there's going to be a lot of those aha moments and a lot of gems for folks. If you're listening, make sure you have a pen and paper or the Notes app on your phone, because I'm sure there's a lot of things about to be dropped in this podcast that you're going to note down. First, I just want to start off, could you introduce yourself to our guests and just tell them a little bit about who you are and what you're up to right now?
Absolutely. Born and raised in the city of Newark, New Jersey, which for our viewers, as opposed to our audio listeners that have a Zoom background here, which actually is the city of Newark. And you can see in the distance off where City Hall is. And I grew up in the Eastward neighborhood of Newark, which is the largely Portuguese and Southern American / Hispanic portion of the city. And why that's so interesting is because I'm actually of mixed heritage, Black on my father's side and Portuguese American on my mother's side. My mother immigrated to the United States with my grandparents when she was 5 years old. And that mixed heritage has always been fundamental to my identity, to my upbringing. I grew up speaking English and Portuguese at the same time, and grew up in a neighborhood and in a city really that is so multicultural that although I am of mixed race, race in itself was something that I didn't fully understand or conceptualize until very late in my life, because it was just very normal for me to just see this interracial relationship between my parents, and I just thought it was normal. It's not strange at all that mom is one color, one race, and dad is the other. So I think that those early exposures to interracial relationships, to multicultural dynamics and cultures, very much influence what is still a fundamental part of me now, which is this understanding, acceptance, compassion, but also just curiosity for people of all faiths, creeds, ethnic and racial backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, because there was such a hodgepodge of that already in Newark and in that neighborhood and even in my household. So I credit a lot of how I navigate the world and how I view the world with growing up in a city like Newark. And that's also, I think, a large part of my commitment now to, and I'm sure we'll get into this later in the podcast, but my commitment to community development, to civil rights, social justice work, just trying to make a difference in disadvantaged communities to the best that I can, is because growing up in a place like Newark, it is a predominantly minority, largely Black and Latinx, under-resourced urban community that needs a lot of help. And I know that going to school in Newark, I went through the public school system. I saw some of the vast levels of inequality that's extant in our country, unfortunately, where I was in a high school where, even though I was extremely devoted to, at that time, I actually thought I was going to be an aerospace engineer. So I'm not. Although at that time, I was extremely devoted to physics, math, biology, all of that, because I was on this engineering track. It was always those STEM classes where we would have two, three, sometimes four students grouped around a textbook, because we didn't have enough textbooks for everybody. And if you wanted to review the work at home for a test that you had, or one of your assignments required you to use a textbook, you usually had to take photos on your phone and then use your phone photos to inform your work, because you couldn't take the textbooks home. They didn't have enough in the event that somebody would actually keep it or damage it or lose it, or whatever would happen. So anyway, just some of those perceptions, even just thinking about friends, we were hardcore gamers. I was actually ranked on several video games. I was that much of a hardcore gamer, and I got really into Major League Gaming and things like that. Why was I such a hardcore gamer? Because it wasn't always the wisest decision to go out where we were, especially not around where we went to school. It unfortunately was one of the more challenged neighborhoods in the city. We knew that there was a certain time by which you wanted to get home. You didn't want to be hanging around the school, especially not outside. And it was also the fact that we didn't always have money to go to the movie theaters or to do any of these other, what at the time seemed to us very lavish social activities that people in high school would generally do with each other. So what do? We were fortunate enough to be able to get some money, and especially around the holidays, get an Xbox. And so we just played Xbox all the time with each other. So that's my upbringing. I credit a lot of just what I saw in Newark, what troubled me, with then just this passion for improving conditions in communities like Newark. One of the most pivotal things in the city at the time that struck me was I was student representative on the Newark Public Schools Board of Education as a senior in high school, and got exposed to one of the most tumultuous policy debates in the city's history that framed a lot of my, still to this day, but especially at the time, passion for education policy and school reform. And it was in that moment where, at the same time, I was getting admitted to Princeton and a few of these other top performing schools. And so I had to just really come to terms with the contrast between my personal success at the time and this very fraught political and social climate in the city, and had to think a lot about what it means to be a leader and to serve a community, and how I can use my privilege as a soon to be attendee and student at Princeton for the benefit of that community that I was serving at the time. So that sets the tone for a lot of what would then become my academic journey and personal story. I would go on to attend Princeton, was fortunate to do very well there and to have a remarkable experience that then set the foundations for me to study at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. I was the first Rhodes Scholar in the history of the Newark public school system, which was just a remarkable moment for the city, one that was, I think, a very important marker and provider of hope, and a symbol for all that Newark was aspiring to be in that moment. We talk a lot about this renaissance that's happening in the city. I mentioned how it's an under-resourced city. It has many of those same challenges that many other large urban centers do across the United States, but we are on what we like to call a comeback and this revitalization. You see a lot of business growth, you see a lot of job creation happening in the city. So there is a zeitgeist right now that is extremely exciting and is hope inspiring. And I think that my selection as a Rhodes Scholar at that moment was just a reflection of that and a symbol of that. It meant a lot. And it was just another way for me to start emerging as a leader in the city. So I used that platform to start getting involved in a variety of community engagement and community development projects. I got exposed to the philanthropist who I'm now working with as chief of staff currently. His name is Ray Chambers. He's from the city of Newark. He had a remarkable career on Wall Street and retired from Wall Street at the top of his game so that he can engage in full-time philanthropy. And so he got me very much engaged in a number of his philanthropic projects in the city. And later, as I was coming back from Oxford, was looking for what would be a great job to get involved with for a while before ultimately attending Yale Law School and Harvard Business School, because I committed to a dual degree. And that was when I met John Simon from the Greenlight Fund, who's actually a Rhodes Scholar, and was looking at expanding his network of nonprofit community development sites through his Greenlight Fund is the name of the nonprofit. And there was this perfect moment where I can work with John to help him expand to Baltimore. And when I was helping expand to Baltimore, I said, okay, I'll do this, but if we do it, you have to promise me that we'll also look at expanding to Newark. And so I helped him actually with expansion into Baltimore and into Newark. And so that's what I've been doing for the last year and a half. And I have about 6 months left now where I'll be still working a bit with John. My full-time role actually is really with Ray as his chief of staff before I start this Yale Law, Harvard Business dual degree. I know that was probably a little bit longer than you were looking for, but I just think it's important to set the stage for what my background is in the city and why I'm so passionate about Newark and all that I do, and also my very complex academic trajectory to this point.
Love it. No, I'm glad you went into all that detail. I noted down a few things that we're definitely going to get into later in the episode. But I think for the listeners, that's a good overview of Jordan's background and everything that he's been up to. And for the rest of this episode, we're definitely going to pick apart those specific experiences and really deconstruct it and go deep into the lessons that you've learned and how those things have changed you. I wanted to ask one question before we get into your time at Princeton. What did you want to be growing up? You mentioned you want to be an aerospace engineer. Did you want to be like a scientist or an engineer when you were growing up, or was it something else?
Depends on what stage of my childhood we're talking about. So for most of high school, for the most part, being an engineer was my objective. I was gifted in STEM subjects. They were fascinating to me. The concept of being an aerospace engineer, and particularly I love the idea of working for NASA one day and being able to work on these spaceships and this concept of building the spacecrafts that would actually be able to enable at some point space transportation and exploration, I just thought was fascinating. I don't know if that was like the Star Wars and Star Trek and Planet of the Apes geek in me or what. Whatever it was, I was deeply fascinated by it. But the even more fervent, I would say, wish, and it wasn't based on any type of logic at all, it was just this childhood dream of mine, is one that really I can trace back to as early as preschool and kindergarten. When I was in kindergarten, we had this activity where the teachers, they were asking us, what do you want to be when you grow up? And at that age, everybody just has these aspirational thoughts largely based on those who they view as protectors and as being like community pillars and leaders. So they say, I want to be a fireman. I want to be a policeman. I want to be a businessman. Everybody has this leadership focused model on what they want to be. And I did too, but mine was much more lofty. And I said, I've stood up proudly and I said, I want to be the president of the United States of America when I grow up. And here's this little black boy in pre-K or kindergarten saying he wants to be the president of the United States of America. And this is pre-Obama. The teachers are just looking at me like, oh, that's very nice, Jordan. In their mind, they're probably like, okay, that's great. But that I think that was just a reflection of my mindset still to this day, but even from a young age that my parents really cultivated in me is you be whatever you want to be in the world. And don't let anybody tell you that you can't. And don't let the statistics convince you that it's impossible, because all the statistics are evidence of probability and occurrence to this point. But you can be the unlikely person to break the statistics. And so that was At that stage, president. Later, when I had some bit of rationality and research behind it and life experience, aerospace engineer. Then I get to Princeton and I'm almost positive I'm going to be a lawyer. So things changed a lot.
I love it. What's funny is you mentioned how we have these very leadership focused ambitions when we're children. And then as we go about in the world and we get almost pulled down in some cases to be forced to be realistic or to be forced to be practical or whatever you want to call it. And I think the people who we get those messages from, sometimes it's our own family, sometimes it's just society at large. It's, you just hear people talking. Those are well intentioned, but ultimately it's those kind of childlike ambitions and things that really, if you can tap into them, like you're doing now, funnily enough, with your desire to be president, was to try and probably make America better and to try and probably not for the role of you want to be a president, but to actually try and make an impact on people. And I think you're well on your way to do that with your current trajectory in life and all the work that you're doing. So it's funny how those things rear themselves and reveal themselves through our life. I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned, or about how you changed during your time at Princeton. So you came to Princeton from Newark. From what I can gather, similarly for me from South Africa, not too many people from where we come from end up at Princeton. You obviously made the most of everything that you were doing there, getting involved in service and things like that. So I'm curious about during your time at Princeton, how do you think you changed and how did the environment actually teach you more about yourself and like what you wanted in the world?
I will say that even before getting to Princeton, I had engaged in extensive introspection around who I wanted to be and how I thought that Princeton could aid, enhance, and facilitate my journey towards becoming that person. And I felt that served me well because I would approach my extracurriculars, my academics, my social engagements, et cetera, with conviction and purpose. But I was also quite intent to the extent possible to not let Princeton change me too much. Like that actually was an explicit priority of mine. And in speaking with a lot of people, they were weary of what a place like Princeton, with its immense amount of privilege and also becoming increasingly more diverse with every year, but just still just looking at the statistics, not necessarily as diverse as it could be, and certainly doesn't have the largest African American population. Coming from a place like Newark that's largely Black and Hispanic, I had many people say, just be careful. You're gonna be in a very different place, and don't let that stuff get to your head. And they meant well, and I think that what they were basically saying is just remember where you came from, and remember who you are, and don't ever lose the essence of what makes you as you undergo this incredibly transformative and in many beautiful and positive ways, but also potentially dangerous to the extent that it might remove the essence of who you are experience at Princeton. And so, what did Princeton do that was phenomenal while still, I think, complementing the integrity of what I even wanted from Princeton, which was this devotion to service, this devotion to improving and giving back to my city? Like, part of what drew me to Princeton was this motto of being in the service of humanity. So Princeton certainly complemented, enhanced, and furthered all of those sensibilities. What it did that was unique and was new, and I would say needed a lot of work coming in, was it it refined and further deepened my commitment to understanding and engaging with people. So this is a fascinating concept because what I'm saying here is I came into Princeton knowing that I wanted to serve and being incredibly devoted to service as a concept, having taken on many leadership responsibilities in high school, whether it was actually at my school or, like I said, on the board of ed. Was always devoted to service and being in a position where I can actually be of use to a public cause. But I wasn't always fascinated or that engaged with interpersonal connection. And what Princeton did was it took this person who wanted to be a leader for the sake of a cause to now being a person who just wanted to be a leader because I truly loved, appreciated, and wanted to engage at every possible intersection with the complexities and unique compositions of people. That's something that Princeton cultivated, because it's something that I can trace back to my freshman year there, where I'm somebody whose my head is very much in the books. I'm like really focused to trying to crack this Princeton code because it's challenging. It's a new environment. Everything's so grand, from the buildings to the classrooms to even just being in such a different socioeconomic and racial context from anything I'd been exposed to growing up in Newark. It was all a learning adjustment, a learning period and an adjustment period. So everything was so different. It very much was just like, get this task done, get that task done. I was like a super productive freshman. But what I saw was this gentleman, this professor, who I idolized, and those who went to Princeton are familiar with him will know why he's such a character and a figure, a legend, really. But it's Jeff Nunakawa, who, when I
Yeah.
was a freshman, was the head of Rockefeller College, which was my dormitory system. And Jeff, as the head of Rockefeller College, basically must have had jurisdiction and administrative responsibility over upwards of 300 and something, 400 and something students. But Jeff knew every one of those students' names and had some tangible connection to each and every one of them. You would see him walk into the Rockefeller dining room, and immediately, just as he's walking down the main corridor of the dining room, because the tables on the left side, tables on the right, that leaves this walking space in between. And as he's walking down that space in between tables, he's turning to his left, he's shouting out, "Hey, Jack, hey, Mary, hi, Ann." He's turning to his right, he's, "Hey, Sam, good to see you, how you been?" And he just knows everybody. And I'm sitting here as this freshman, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, how does Jeff just know everybody? He's hugging everybody. This is obviously pre-COVID. He's hugging everybody, he's talking to them. And I just see this incredible amount of energy and love and positivity that he is imbuing in everybody, and that he is emanating as he's walking. It's almost like you can feel it, and you're getting energy just from seeing the energy that he's giving off. And I said in that moment, I said, I want to be like Jeff. I want to be that person who, just my presence and my interaction with somebody can make their day better, especially as I was personally just viewing some of the toxicity, some of the negativity, the very deep personal struggles that a place like Princeton can encourage, or let me say can cause, just because of all of the pressures. That was so dangerous to me. And I always prided myself, I know we can talk about this because I know that you also have a deep interest in this, but I always prided myself in trying to refine and enhance your mental toughness. And that was, I think, just, I grew up very much loving the sport of football. And it's something that they talk about a lot in football, is you have to have mental toughness. You can be the most physically tough player out there, you can be dominant, you can be the most gifted athlete in the world, but if you're not mentally tough in the moment, when the lights are on, you're not going to perform in the clutch. And so that was something that I had at Princeton that I was so invested in, and it pained me and it hurt me to see people who were so deeply unraveled in these mental health struggles, and I try to be of service to them. And as I was personally just starting to open up myself to wanting to be of service to people and not just causes or organizations, I saw this person in Jeff who was like the ultimate interpersonal, optimistic bundle of energy. And I said, I want to be Jeff. That's exactly who I need to be. And so I from that moment just really set out to, no matter what I was doing, just always flip this switch when I was in the presence of somebody else, where it was no longer about me, but I wanted it to be about them. I wanted to learn about them. I wanted to engage with them, and in any way possible, just try to make their day better. And what that did was it created this lens through which I see the world now. And I would say that this was also particularly facilitated by my serving as an RCA, or what most schools would call an RA, in my junior and senior year. Because at that point, now I'm responsible for seriously like 20 students, and I have to no longer think about Princeton solely through my own personal academic, social, extracurricular lens, but at least have some bit of an understanding and concern for 20 different other people's as well. So Princeton certainly helped with this in that regard. But the point is that the lens through which I see the world now is that in everything I do, I try to completely remove myself from it. I try to, as much as possible, put myself in a position where I am reflecting the person with whom I am engaging, whether that's as a colleague that I'm engaged on a project with, whether that's a mentee that I'm engaged with, or somebody who I'm just meeting and we're just talking to try to get to know each other better. I want to reflect. I want to be able to listen, to gather as much of who you are and understand you, so that I can connect with you on our fundamental similarities. And we may have a lot of differences, but I believe that if I can just do a good enough job of understanding who you are, I can find at its core where we also merge. And I think that's the beauty of then human interaction, because that sets all sorts of really cool launching points where we can just have a beautiful moment that we share, whether it's in only that moment and we never interact again, or it then becomes the basis for a friendship that we can build. But it's something that Princeton cultivated in me, is I truly do see the best in people. And I feel like in a world where we are so critical of ourselves and mental health struggles are so rampant, and just toxicity, everything from toxic productivity to toxic masculinity to toxic health behaviors, you name it, from top to bottom, toxicity is so rampant that I want to be that person who can reassure you that you're pretty awesome, because I truly believe it and I want you to understand it and believe it too. And that's something that I can directly attach to Princeton.
I love it. There's a few things that I want to elaborate on and emphasize for the listeners. So the first one is this idea of being people-centric versus cause-centric. I think this is something I've seen in the tech world as well. A lot of people come in with different motivations. Some people are interested in the technology. Some people are interested in just changing the world and wanting to be someone who's had an impact on the world. But I think the lens through which I've seen the most success from people is the folks who are focused on solving human problems. So there's a branch of computer science that I really liked called human computer interactions, called HCI, one of the most transformative classes that I actually took at Princeton. And through that lens, you start to see technology and, in your case, your life and the things that you're doing, all about solving human problems and not necessarily being led by some ideology or something else first, but always saying, how can we approach things from the human perspective and be as close to the human problem that we're trying to solve, and then try and figure out how do we use technology and other means in service of that. And I think what your story underlies is that focus on people and understanding that everything that you're doing, there's a person at the end of the day that you're trying to make life better for, no matter what job you're in, no matter what situation you find yourself in. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about people. And so I love that, how that's a thread that we can trace through your life as well. The second thing that I wanted to mention was your focus on others. So apart from just people, being very other-centric in what you're doing. Tony Robbins has a phrase where he says, the quickest way to cut your problems in half is to take the focus off yourself and focus on others. See how you can give, see how you can serve, because then that really stops you being self-indulgent in your problems. And while there's a lot of mental health issues and anxiety that is very legitimate, some of it is generated by a increased focus, especially in the modern society, on me. Your Instagram, your TikTok, everything is about you. How are you looking? What are you doing? What is this? And so I think that I love how you also have demonstrated that this focus on others is something that has given you a lot of energy and has given you a lot of different perspective, and is one of the things that you're actually trying to carry as a mindset for your life. Two questions that I had were, the first one is, you talked about not wanting to let Princeton change you. I'm curious about how you shielded yourself from that mimetic influence of other people. Because I know you hear a lot of people coming into Princeton, they wanted to do something, they end up as consultants or investment bankers just because they see other people doing it. And so I'm curious, as someone who obviously coming from backgrounds like you and I, where you don't come from the most affluent areas in the world, don't come from the most affluent families, it can be enticing to go down those paths for the financial rewards. And so I'm curious about how you actually shielded yourself from that and stayed true to your own purpose and your own path when all the stuff is going on around you.
It was important for me to have a North Star. And I will quickly link this back to my last point, because I think it's such an important one, is that focus, that people-centric focus that I developed, and this commitment that I had to engaging with and understanding others and appreciating them and celebrating them in a world that I think too often is trying to tear them down. And if the world isn't, then too often we're tearing ourselves down. That became
100%.
a central focus of mine, and it evolved into a mantra. I wake up and I think to myself and I say to myself, if I can make one person's day better, then my day is made infinitely better. If I can make one person's life better, then my life is made infinitely better. And then I go out and I strive in any way possible to make a person's day better, to make a person's life better. And it's everything from the macro things that I do with my work, etc., to even the micro things. Like I was the RCA who would always go that extra mile. And if it was one of my advisees' birthdays, I had a stack of birthday cards that I kept in my room, and I would take a birthday card and I would write a handwritten note in their birthday card. I'd seal it up and I'd stick it under their door really early in the morning because I'm an early riser. So I was always up before they were, unless they pulled an all-nighter, and then I'd know about it. But I'd stick a birthday card under their door just to try to make their day better. And all of a sudden my day's better, but it wasn't for me. But all that is to say, that was my mantra. And I think that I had a similar kind of North Star and mission that guided a lot of my time at Princeton and always allowed me to remain true to self and stay focused on my personal path, even at times when there were social pressures or other external contingencies that may have tried to lead me astray. So what that was for me, it was Newark, right? Like again, I knew coming in that I cared about the city. And I would say that my relationship with the city and my conceptualization of how I wanted to engage with the city were certainly things that evolved and became much clearer later on. Like I don't want to say I came into Princeton day one and I knew by the time I graduated, this is what I'm going to do in the city of Newark. Absolutely not. And I would say that even by the time I was a senior, it still wasn't all that clear. But I knew I cared about the city. And I knew that to the extent possible, that concern for the city and for addressing the social and economic and political issues that were evident in the city, in cities like Newark, that was something that got me going. And it was at that point the largest source of fulfillment and purpose in my life. And so that meant that when it came time to engage in extracurriculars, and all these students, you're a freshman, they're pulling you in, you got to be in Glee Club, you got to be in this club and that club and this one, this one. And I'm like, oh my gosh. For me, it's take a step back. What gives me energy? What brings me fulfillment and joy and purpose? And again, I know that at that point it was education policy and urban education reform in particular because of that role I had played in Newark. And so I got involved in Students for Education reform as a freshman. I then also got involved in the College Counseling Project, which was a extracurricular where we would actually go and provide mentorship and college advising and test prep services for students at Trenton Central High School. And I knew that Trenton had a similar demographic and faced a number of the same socioeconomic and political issues that Newark did. So those two were just perfect fits for me. And I knew that it was right for me to pick them because I had a vision for what my North Star was. Later on, as I would take on more clubs, things like that, to the extent that I could loop in that focus on urban community issues and service, or in some regard, education policy, I always did so. Now, where that changed, which was fascinating, was when I started doing research, I actually pivoted hard from education and I started doing maternal and child health in the United States. And maternal and child health actually became my research focus for my junior fall paper and spring paper. But that was because I had a professor who became a mentor to me who was deeply influential. And what I started recognizing was that I also didn't want to be fully invested in a single cause. And although I really cared about education, I didn't want that to be the only issue around which I can serve as an advocate. And I also felt strongly that as a male who does, even despite suffering a number of injustices and disadvantages as a person of color, I still enjoy a certain level of privilege by nature of being a male. And so I knew that as a male in this century and in this day and age, it was important for me to understand the struggles and the injustices that are confronted by women, and to try to understand them enough to serve as an advocate and to truly adhere to my values as a feminist that my mom always imbued in me. And so that's why I got into that track. But here's what I did with it. Now I get to my senior thesis. This is my culmination of my Princeton academic career, and it should be my capstone project that loops together everything I did. And here I have the elements of, like I said, at this point, I already know I'm really passionate about going to law school. I have this education policy thing, which is always my thing until I get to junior year. It's like, now I have this maternal and child health thing, which I'm really passionate about. I just wrote 2 papers on it. And I still have this Newark thing, which was always my thing, or at least like urban communities in general. So what do? I write a paper on school-based support services for pregnant and parenting students in the Newark Public Schools District. So school-based gave me the education policy aspect of this, school-based support services For pregnant and parenting students, this had that maternal and child health element to it. In the Newark Public Schools district, then allowed me to loop it back to my hometown. And I analyzed it through the lens of what is required, what are those required services under Title IX federal guidance, and then what are some of the best practices that we see happening in other cities as compared to Newark. And so that was a perfect kind of 4-part way to loop in education policy, maternal and child health, Newark, and law. And I think that's just an example of, to the extent that I could, no matter what I had to do at Princeton, I always returned back to what is my bread and butter? What do I care about? What am I passionate about? What makes me? And yes, I may have to do things a little bit differently because this is how we do things socially. This is what's going on extracurricularly. This is what's going on academically. But I'm always going to try to be really creative and really insightful and intentional about looping it back to the essence of who I am. And I felt like that project was one that I was just so passionate about, because to be able to not only loop in the law and the education and the maternal and child health, which I thought was already a win because it was creative, but then to do it in service to my city was just so important to me. And it actually was tangibly helpful to the city, because when I was in the public and international affairs school, so we were a largely policy driven school. Most of our theses involved recommendations. And so after comparing what Newark should have been doing and could have been doing, whether required or just simple best practices in the field, I had a set of recommendations for how Newark could improve. I actually went into the city over the course of 2 to 3 months. I engaged in interviews in 11 of the 18 different high schools. I got first person accounts from principals and vice principals and guidance counselors about what they were doing. And then I compared it to what they could be doing or should be doing. And I had a set of recommendations for how the district could improve at the district level and the school level. And I then submitted those recommendations to the superintendent, who I knew quite well, and to all of the schools with whom I interviewed. And after having completed that project and submitted my recommendations, they had actually developed a position and a set of responsibilities at the district level around pregnant and parenting student support coordination and oversight and management. And so it actually did have a tangible difference in the city. And I think it's just a perfect example of whenever people, especially like incoming students in college, not just Princeton in general, say, like, how can I still do the things I care about? How can I still be me? I say, there are going to be a set of things that you're going to have to do, and there's going to be all these pressures to do this and do that. But just always, if you do something, do it because it mattered to you, and do it in a way that reflects the essence of what makes you and what gives you passion and energy. And for me, whenever I could loop in Newark, there was that. And I will just say one last thing is also, I just tried my best not to do something because people were doing it. So like, I wasn't in a fraternity. I know that fraternities aren't a big thing at Princeton, but I was in a fraternity. I was in an eating club for one semester, and then I dropped my eating club, which are like the Princeton equivalents of fraternities, when I was a junior and a senior, because I was an RA, and I just really cared about being in the dormitories with my advisees and being really present in the residential college system rather than being in the eating club, even though that was a far more popular thing to do. I was talking like upwards of 70% of students. So beyond just remembering like who I am and connecting Newark, this thing had nothing to do with Newark. This was just an element of, I don't want to do that. I know the better thing for me to do, just based on what I care about, would be to just stay in the dormitories. And so I did it. And it was really important for me never to do something because people say you should do it, or like statistics show most Princeton students do that. It was like, okay, yeah, I'm not trying to live an ordinary Princeton life. Like, I'm trying to live the Princeton life that complements who I am and gives me the most energy and fulfillment. Like, I'm paying the tuition to be here. Like, it's going to be handcrafted to the extent that I can make it for me.
So much to unpack from what you said. The first thing I want to touch on is this idea of alignment and combining your interests. One thing that came up from what you were saying is how you basically aligned all these different passions and interests that you have and things that you picked up along the way, things like the child and maternal health, interest in the education system, and your city of Newark. It reminds me of advice that I often give to people when they ask me, how did you start your company while in college? A lot of what I tried to do was engage in activities that would push me in the direction that made it easier to align my various interests. So in your case, we talked about the stuff that you're interested in. In my case, it was entrepreneurship, it was technology, it was startups and business. And so it's funny how it's the same principle, but those are two different manifestations of that. The second thing I wanted to mention is this idea of purpose as a filter for what you're trying to do. So you came in and while you didn't have a narrative of, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this, and this is exactly the path that I'm going to walk. But you had a beacon for what is it that in your words, gave you energy? What is it that made you feel like this is the thing that I want to do in my life? I want to contribute and help to better the city that you come from. And one of the things that I also tell people is that once you get tapped into your sense of purpose, that allows you to live a much more authentic life far more easily, because then you can use that as like a filter to say, put all the opportunities that you have coming in, and then that purpose will filter to say, okay, this is for me and this is not for me. And that can also help in, as you mentioned in your case, try to live life such that you're not doing things just because other people say it's interesting or other people are doing it, and figure out what is uniquely suited to you. So I thought that was worth mentioning as well. And then the last thing I want to bring it back to is this idea of mental toughness. I said before we move on in the conversation, I want to get your kind of practices and what's worked for you in order for developing that mental toughness. Because I think that kind of resilience, there's a book by Angela Duckworth called Grit. And she says that being gritty is one of the most important characteristics and important mindsets that young children and kids can develop. And it's one of the determinants for success in the modern world. So I'm curious about how you go about developing that mental toughness and making sure that you're nurturing this in your life.
Absolutely. And I love the book. She also has a great TED Talk on it. I would rank her TED Talk right below your caveman transformation TED Talk. But
We'll put a link in the show notes for folks to check out that TED Talk.
both hers and yours. But it's such an essential quality. It's one that I reflect on often and try to cultivate in every facet of my life, because I truly believe that I would not be where I am today without that resilience, without that desire to apply myself 110%. I don't say I'm going to give 100%. It's like, no, I'm going to go to the extent that I can all the way. And then I'm going to give more. I'm going to go beyond the essence of what seems possible in the moment for me or for anybody. So I give 110%. I go the extra mile when I don't think I can continue any further than I've already. But that essential quality and that devotion to just always going the extra mile, I truly credit with just what I've been able to accomplish, because my mentality coming into Princeton, especially coming from a place like Newark, where there aren't many people who go to schools like Princeton. And there was this concern among people who had my best interest at heart that I would get to a place like Princeton coming from an under-resourced, somewhat obscure high school. It's not like I was going to one of these great boarding schools. It's not like I was going to go there and all of a sudden, just by nature of saying where I went to high school, I was going to say, oh, I went to Exeter, and everybody's eyes get wide. It's, oh my God, no, like I didn't have that. Right? I went to University High School in Newark, New Jersey. And I'd say it with pride every time, because that's who I am and that's where I come from. And I'm about to show you what university did and how I'm a proud product of it. But I have to prove it. I don't have the benefit of a fancy name to all of a sudden just give a conception of what I bring to the table just by nature of having it on the resume. And so that instilled and incited grit. I had to be gritty. I had to want to prove it. I had to work a little extra harder to show you that I was capable. And not only am I capable, but I can thrive in this environment. And so that was my mentality coming in, is I don't care if you're more talented than me. I don't care if you're wealthier than me. I don't care if you come from a background that is inherently more advantageous than I do. You will never outwork me. And I will always, to the best of my ability, put in the work required to come out on top. And it's funny that I have that very competitive approach to my day-to-day in life, because like I said, I just love people, and like I'm the most opening and inviting and an all around collaborative person that you'll ever meet. But when it comes time to hold myself accountable, that's when the lights are on, and that's when I get competitive. And it's a very inward facing type of competition where I'm really just running a race against myself. And yes, I am running a race against others, to the extent that if somebody's working harder than me, then I know I got to step up and I got to put in a little extra work. If I'm waking up at this time and you're waking up at that time and you got an hour of extra work on me, then maybe I got to reevaluate what time I go to sleep and what time I wake up. So there's that element of other people do factor into that personal drive and motivation. But at the end of the day, it's only to the extent that I recognize that by nature of them working really hard, they're making themselves better. And I'm fully committed to making myself better. So why wouldn't I work harder if I see them working harder? It's still an inward facing type of commitment to competition and this very rigorous form of living your life, very routine and structured form of living your life. Now, why I think it's so important is because it offered structure and a sense of control at a time when it was very easy with all that was available at Princeton extracurricularly, all that was coming at you socially, and then all that just by nature of being a student there was always on your plate and on your mind academically, to feel overwhelmed and to feel lost. And the moment that I flipped that switch and I realized that I am in control, and to the extent that I learned the proper habits and techniques for managing my time, for studying, for being productive and just being the best version of myself, I can control this. And no longer am I going to be subject to the many forces and contingencies that Princeton throws at me, whether that's my advisees all of a sudden are coming to me with a deep personal struggle that immediately I'm going to drop everything to account for, or it's just a friend who wants to hang out and it's like unexpected. So they drop by, they're like, hey, I brought the Xbox, let's look it up and play. All of these things that happen, or just like a paper that all of a sudden starts creeping up on me. The things that happen when you're not intentionally going about your day to day, very much aware of what you're about to accomplish and how you're going to go about doing it, just terrified me. And so I developed a system. I will openly say all the time that I believe strongly in waking up early and getting a head start on your day while everybody else is still asleep, because all the distractions are gone. So I at Princeton started that very early. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. consistently. And this was a time when everybody was like student life, sleeping in until, if they had an 8:30, that was considered early for them. I'd already been up for 3 hours, and I would do my readings for lecture in the time that I had while everything else was still quiet, and I had that moment to myself. And I would always go to lecture with the readings done. And people would say, Jordan, how do you do all these readings? And I say, I build time into my schedule for it. And usually it's that beautiful quiet moment where, what else are you going to do at 5 in the morning but read? So I developed a devotion to waking up early. Now I recognize, as I've become more committed to the habit building practice and these concepts of building mental toughness and productivity into your life, that there were names for things that I was doing back then. So another thing that I would do is, whenever I would have all of these tasks coming at me, and I knew that there were all these action items that were on the table, is I would take out my phone and I would just jot it all down. And so I just need to get it down. And then like later on at the end of the day, I'd go back and I'd organize it. And I'd say, okay, I'm going to do this tomorrow. I'm going to do this Wednesday. I'm going to do this Thursday. And I have 3 days blocked out. And that gave me purpose. That gave me structure. And I was good to go. I didn't have to worry about it anymore. Now I recognize like there's actually a system for that. It's called getting things done. It's the GTD method, where basically just
By David Allen. Yeah.
Yep, you just write down a bunch of stuff and then like you sequence it and you go about and you tackle it. There are all of these cool things out there that help you apply these really helpful tactics and habits into your life that I'm passionate about. But again, I always like to start with the purpose, because when people hear my schedule, they say, Jordan, why in the world do you wake up at these ungodly hours? First of all, I don't think it's ungodly. I think they're the blessed hours. All right, these are the beautiful hours of the day. But to others, they do seem ungodly. Why do you wake up at these ungodly hours? Like, why are you always doing X? Why are you always doing Y? And I don't have an option not to. When you come from a place like I do, and you recognize that everything that I've managed to accomplish at this point is very much a reflection of the fact that I was always willing to wake up at that time, to put in that extra hour of reading, to do that extra reading. When people said, oh, I don't think I need to do that reading, it's probably not going to be on the test, I didn't care. I knew I needed to do that reading. I knew I needed to go meet with that professor. If there was a question, I wasn't going to leave that question unanswered. It's okay. It's probably going to be like a small part of the test. If it's any part of the test, I better know it in and out. Like, that was always my mentality, is I need to be, whatever it is that I'm doing right now, I need to be doing it 110%, period. That's social. If I'm going to commit to any social activity and just trying to be a good friend, I'm going to always try to be the best friend possible. If I'm going to commit to doing community service, I'm going to try to be the best community advocate and service provider possible. It's anything I set my mind to, I need to be fully present and fully committed to it. And it's a personal accountability thing at this point. It's because I know that it has very outward implications and impact purposes, but it becomes a lifestyle to the extent that I get personally frustrated if I know that I'm not actually operating to my highest standards of accountability. And if there's any sense in there that I'm starting to let up and I'm not actually performing the way that I should be, I got to check myself. And it's no, remember the vision, remember where you're trying to go, and recognize that it's the small things that get you there. It really is. Here's a great example, actually, I'll give you. When I was writing my thesis, I would wake up, like I said, 5 a.m., I'd shower, eat a nice big breakfast to fuel my day. And I would always go to the same computer cluster in Rockefeller, Holder Hall at 6:30 a.m., 7 a.m. at the latest, every morning to write my thesis. I only had 2 classes, so I was only in class a couple of days a week. And every day that I wasn't in class, for the most part, I was writing my thesis, 6:30 a.m., 7 a.m. start at the latest. And so I was always the first person in. And you'd have all these students come because there's a major printer down there. They'd print their papers. They'd always see me. They'd say hi. They'd talk to me for a bit. It was a good distraction because I was in a pretty public place where I was writing my thesis. I can't tell you how many students, because again, I was a senior there, but I was an RA, so most of the students around me were freshmen and sophomores. I can't tell you how many freshmen and sophomores now who are on their way to graduating or have already graduated have circled back with me recently as we were talking and I was congratulating them on their graduation. They said, Jordan, I just want to thank you because you showed me how you should do Princeton. You inspired me. I know you didn't even think anything of it because you were there with your headphones on, just typing away. But every morning I would go down before my class to go print out my papers. And I saw you sitting there working on that thesis. And I started getting creative about it. I started going a little bit earlier to print my papers and you were always there. And that just showed me how you should do Princeton. And it's not a matter of the fact that you woke up early, but it's that you were so routine, you were so regimented, you were so intent and intentional with how you're approaching Princeton. And even I've had people tell me the same thing about precepts. It's like, Jordan, every time you came to precept, you had your readings done, you knew your stuff, but more importantly, you then complemented the discussion. Because I always tried not to take up space. Yeah, I knew my stuff because I did the readings, but I also wanted to open up space for other people to participate. And I wanted to learn from them and to try to add to the discussion and to elevate their ideas with what I knew rather than just spewing out what I knew. And I've also had people say the same thing about that. It's like, Jordan, you showed me how to do Princeton precepts. And it was this perfect combination of collegiality and preparation that you brought that inspired me. And that to me, that's all the motivation I need to every day keep holding myself accountable. Is I'm not just doing it for me anymore. At that point, it's, oh my gosh, like this matters. Like people see the work that you put in and you inspire and empower them to be their best selves. Like, why wouldn't you every day wake up at that time that sucks when you know that it could drastically change somebody else's life? Yeah, it's gonna be good for your life. I guarantee somebody tries to adopt some of these, just like even half of these productivity tactics into their life, it'll be good for their life. But more importantly, just watch the influence and the impact that it has on everybody who you surround, and just see the way that it rises all boats. It really does. It sets a tone that makes everybody else want to go that extra mile too. And before you know it, you're just like this awesome constant emitter of positive energy and productivity. And again, I say productivity somewhat aware of the fact that it can be toxic if you're not careful with it. But I think that channeled in the right ways, oh my gosh, it's a beautiful thing to see how inspired people get by just watching somebody who's so devoted and so committed to their craft.
I think one thing that you said that really stuck with me is you say people ask you, Jordan, why do you work so hard? And you said, I work so hard because I don't have an option not to, because I know that this is what I have to do and I don't have any other way to live life. And what you said reminded me of this phrase that says, how you do anything is how you do everything. And the power of having high standards for yourself and internalizing quality in everything that you're doing, that allows you to then take that depth and transfer it from one activity to another. There's a theme that I read called thematic interconnectedness, which says that all these different themes that you have in life, your experience with working hard, for example, in the gym, I know you value health and fitness quite a lot. That experience working hard in the gym is going to then translate to other parts of your life, such as academics, maybe it's personal relationships, maybe you're going to start pushing through discomfort in other things that you're trying to do because you've experienced that in the realm of lifting weights or being in the gym or something like that. And I think that what you say, being that beacon of quality for people by giving your 100% in all aspects of your life, that's something I think a lot of people can learn from. Even for someone like me, I listen to motivational speakers every day. This really inspires me to lead by example, to live your life as if, you're going about it and not necessarily trying to inspire people superficially, but knowing that, hey, everything that I'm doing is not just for me. It's other people looking up to me and seeing and going to emulate me. So let me actually bring the quality and bring everything that I can to everything that I'm doing, because you never know who's going to actually be taking inspiration from that. It reminds me of Eric Thomas. I'm not sure you're familiar with him. He's a motivational speaker. But a lot of what you're saying is, why do you wake up? He says, why do you wake up 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning? He says, because I got my mama counting on me. I got my sister counting on me. I got a world who wakes up just to watch me. And so every day I got to go at it. I'm really inspired by that. And I really love the fact. And thank you for sharing that on this podcast.
I do have a couple. Again, this is one of those things where it's you have something that works and you adopt it, and you don't always have the vernacular in the moment to articulate what it was you were doing or what inspires you to do it. You just know it's important. And so that was how I viewed waking up early at Princeton. I just knew it was important and it helped. And now I understand, again, just having had conversations with people who talk about how much it influenced and inspired them, etc. I have a much more dynamic perception for why it matters, and it's why I still do it. Back then it was out of necessity. Now it's because I understand it's out of necessity for a different reason. Back then it was required to do well. Now it's required to live the life and to become the leader that I want to be. But the point I was going to make is, if we're just putting names out there, a couple of people who I've been following just recently that I got really into is, I just read Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins.
David Goggins, Taking Souls.
Taking Souls, Stay Hard. David Goggins is a different breed, but he talks a lot about, so this concept of taking souls is fascinating. It's this concept of being so imposingly dominant and awe-inspiring at whatever you set your mind to, that in the moment that somebody observes you excelling at that activity or in that field of work, whatever, it's like their soul leaves their body. It's like you are that phantasmically, just awe-inspiringly great that for a brief moment, it's like you literally killed them. And he has several really engaging examples of that in his memoir. But why I associate with David Goggins so much, and then the other one who I've been following quite closely recently is Jocko Willink. And I think
Extreme Ownership. We read a bunch of similar people.
Yep. What they both have in common is that they're both Navy SEALs. So maybe I made the wrong choice and I should have gone into the military. But they have this really similar mindset around discipline. And Jocko Willink's big phrase is discipline equals freedom. And he says that the more disciplined you are now, and the more that you put in effort into acquiring a set of habits that are essentially unbreakable, no matter what you face, those same set of habits will be the bedrock that allows you to overcome those challenges. You will reach a point where you're free. And you may not be free in the sense of no longer facing challenges. That's life. There will always be some sort of arduous obstacle in front of you. But when you have the right toolkit, and that toolkit being your disciplined set of habits and techniques, you can encounter any arduous challenge and find a way to overcome it and to thrive within it to the extent possible. If you're mentioning people to check out, I just had to give a shout out to David Goggins and to Jocko, because their entire mindset and the example that they set, I think, has inspired me and has given me a vernacular for habits and tactics that I long aspired to, and to the extent possible actually implemented within my day-to-day, but didn't fully understand why I was doing it. And they really helped understand that. And they also inspire you because to the extent that you're personally competitive like I am, and you see a person like David Goggins saying he's taking souls, I want to take David Goggins' soul one day. Like, I want to be the person who David Goggins sees and I took his soul. It'll never happen because he's that crazy. But the point is, I think that you reach a point when you're fully committed to personal development where you truly do take joy in being abnormal. Like you have to reach a point where you actually get personal joy and fulfillment from telling somebody your day to day, like your routine, and hearing them say, that's crazy. Like, I want people to tell me that's crazy because I'm doing something right.
When listening to you, I felt semblances of Jocko Willink and David Goggins. And I'm wondering, does Jordan actually read these kinds of people? Does he have time in his busy schedule to actually go about and read these kinds of things? And lo and behold, a lot of the similar figures that have inspired me quite a lot. When I was in college, I started listening to the Jocko podcast, and through founding Avthar, so in my senior year, as we founded this company and then worked on it after graduating, it was listening to Jocko's podcast about discipline equals freedom, and knowing that if you put in the discipline now, whether it's in your health, in your finances, in your academics, that will then give you freedom down the line. And then again, when I was doing Afari the first year after graduating, after all the glitz and glamour of raising money and winning competitions and stuff had essentially quieted down, I started actually listening to You Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. And in the audiobook, it's someone else reading the book and then him giving commentary about what does taking souls mean? What is Buds in the Navy SEALs and how did he like fail it so many times and he came back? And what does it mean to say who's going to carry the boats and stuff like that? Like he has all these phrases and I'm like, wow. And what I used to do is in the gym, I would do my workout and then I'd try and do some cardio or just walking on the treadmill. And I'll put that on and try and internalize it while I'm in the gym. But those are two wonderful figures that I think everyone should check out. And I'm glad that you're someone who's also gaining inspiration. And I'm very sure in the future, people are going to be mentioning Jordan Thomas in the same breath as those kinds of people. I do want to dig into a topic that I've written quite a bit about, and that is the topic of finding your strengths and your natural interests. And so I'm curious about, you mentioned through the course of your time growing up in Newark, going to Princeton, your mindsets have changed. And I want to also incorporate your time as a Rhodes Scholar. And right now, feel free to reference whatever parts of your life in this answer. But I want to know, what was it like in terms of your journey to find your natural strengths and natural interests? And when did you know that this is the thing I want to work on and these are the skills I want to excel at?
It's been a constant evolutionary process, really. So, like I said, in high school, I would have told you my strengths were STEM, and that then translated to me wanting to follow a path of being an aerospace engineer. But what I found, and I would say that this was one of the most defining and transformative periods because it really set a trend that although it would evolve, would branch out starting from here. I almost put that brief foray in STEM pathways aside. And if you actually follow the progression of my personal slash professional slash academic trajectory, it actually branches off from here. And this was the moment when I realized I am not an aerospace engineer. I'm not completely sure what I am, but I feel like what I need to focus on when I get to Princeton is actually something more akin to studying law and policy. And what sparked that illumination and elucidation for me was as I was serving as the student rep on the Board of Education that senior year, I had this moment. There was this evening where we generally were packing out auditoriums that year when we would have our monthly public participation sessions, because like I said, it was one of the tumultuous years in district history. We were having very, very heated debates over charter schools versus public schools, which to this day, for those who are passionate about education policy, know it's probably the most contentious topic in the field. But Newark was a hotbed for charter experimentation at the time, and people had very strong opinions on it in relation to what the superintendent was doing. So there was this night where we seriously had, everybody would get 5 to 10 minutes to speak. We had upwards of 200 people, 300 people sign up that evening, and we went through and listened to every person. We were sitting there for hours and hours, and every person was so aggrieved. Every person was so distraught, and their distress at what they saw was an unjust situation being imposed and contrived by the superintendent's policies was manifest in how they then addressed the board. They were screaming at us vehemently and vitriolically. We were the worst people in the world. I mean, they would come up to us and say, how can you do this to us? How can you let them dismantle our public school system? You failed us. And every person is like, this is criminal. You failed us. You failed us. And I'm sitting there at 17 years old, and I'm just thinking, what does it mean to fail somebody who put you in this position because they believe that you could help them? What does it mean to fail somebody to whom you owe a service and a public good? What does it mean to fail a city? To fail 40,000 public school students in the Newark Public Schools District? What does it mean to let all those people down? And more importantly, how do you make it right? How do we take this failed system as they viewed it? How do we take a system that's no longer serving their best interest? And how do we try to build it again and make it whole and make sure that we're doing right by all the people who trust us enough to put their children in our school system? And that was just an ethos that then branched out from there. Is like, what does it mean to be a leader that's people-centric, grassroots oriented, and actually meeting the community, where they are and with what they need. And as I started thinking a lot more about this, another thing that sparked the change was I was visiting schools as an engineer. I was going to like their admitted student stuff. And I went to Cornell and I was around all these engineers. It was like a diversity and engineering program. And they were all talking about what they were most excited about going to Cornell for. And they were all saying, I want to focus on physics. Finally, I get to only take physics classes. Finally, I get to start taking this class and that class. And they're talking about what they're really excited about not taking anymore. And they're saying, oh my gosh, like I can't wait until I don't have to write any more papers. I can't wait until I don't have to take English anymore. I don't have to take history. And I'm sitting there, hold on a second. I really like those subjects. And low key, like AP language and yeah, like AP language and AP literature were my favorite classes. I loved at that point, I loved the analysis of passages from a rhetorical perspective, trying to really get into what were the strategies being employed to make that a more persuasive and effective text. Like, what was it about that text that makes I Have a Dream appeal to us so much differently than any of the other speakers who spoke at the March on Washington? Like, I fell in love with that. And again, this is like Obama era. So I'm also just somebody who's like very closely watching the great orating skills of Obama and trying to learn what are the strategies and techniques that he's employing that make him so great at communicating a message and capturing hearts. So as I'm starting to think about this, I'm starting to merge what I now recognize as actually my favorite subjects aren't math. My favorite subject is really language and composition. It's understanding rhetoric, it's writing, it's persuasion, and merging that to what was a very clear budding interest in service and leadership and community involvement. And what I recognize is how can I make that passion for community involvement and leadership meet persuasion and writing and logic? And it was like, maybe I should start considering things in the realm of law and policy. And that fundamental change, where I recognize that like my two kind of academic and community strengths are writing, persuasion, understanding rhetoric, and like just broadly engaging in rhetorical analysis. How do you merge that with community issues and social issues? It's like social sciences all the way. And ever since then, academically, I've been on this very social science oriented track with the focus on social justice, social mobility, poverty, inequality. Like when you look at then what I did at Princeton, I was a public international affairs major with a focus on poverty, inequality, and social mobility. When I got to Oxford, I studied evidence-based social intervention and policy evaluation with the focus on community-based intervention and like large-scale macro interventions and poverty support and things like that. And then you look at the work that I did since Oxford at the Greenlight Fund. What Greenlight does is it transports evidence-based impact organizations, like highly evidence-based, high-performing nonprofits and social entrepreneurship projects to new communities. So they'll get into a community, let's say like a Newark, and they'll see, okay, what are some of the issue gaps here? Okay, kindergarten reading level is lagging behind average metrics across the country. Or they'll say homelessness, huge issue. Or they'll say pathways to technology careers. Generally, there are some serious gaps there. They'll find a gap, they'll identify one gap a year, and then they'll scout the nation. It's a venture philanthropy model. So they'll scout the nation for the highest performing nonprofits or social entrepreneurship projects that have successfully addressed that metric in at least 3 other cities. And then they provide the startup capital required for that nonprofit slash social startup to then set up shop in the present city that's facing that problem. And it's just this genius model of like, here's a problem, what's worked elsewhere, let's get that in the city like immediately. And I was helping them expand to Newark and Baltimore because I believe so strongly in we need a robust set of programs to help address the problems at hand. And we need them to be evidence-based. And then even what I do now with Ray, ever since I took on the role as chief of staff, is we engage in philanthropic projects that get to the root of whatever some of the most pressing and persistent issues of our time. We've been really involved in international health for a long time. We do a lot of engagement projects in development projects in the city of Newark. But ever since like late January, it's been all COVID. I've been working on the COVID response. I've been serving as one of the leaders in the city of Newark's COVID-19 task force, helping with setting up test sites around the city and things like that. So I think that when you think about where I found my strengths, I have to go back to that moment where I realized I'm not an engineer. And here's why. And it's because there's this interest in analysis and persuasion and and writing and etc. from an academic perspective that I really like, that somehow I need to jive with this community development and leadership and like broad impact focus that was starting to curate, or let me say starting to emanate from me. And that's when I just put it together and I said, that's social science academically. And then it's as I started discovering more professionally, I realized like all of those social science things that I was interested in, they were all really just as part of this broader commitment to social impact in from a community angle. So it's been this constant process of evolution. It was never super, super clear to me. And even like graduating from Princeton, I would have told you my community angle is education policy. But now when you talk to me, I tell you like, actually, I'm very much more involved in public-private partnerships and tri-sector leadership where you encourage collaboration from the nonprofit, private, and public spheres, because I recognize that it's not just that kind of policy-oriented education lens that I had before. Education is just one pillar of a much broader community development puzzle. Like education is fundamental. I truly believe it's the most viable pathway that we have for social mobility still. But I also recognize that real estate is a big thing. I also recognize that job creation is a big thing. I know that wealth inequality and poverty support is still a big thing. I know that health is a huge thing. We're seeing all the ways in which community demographics and health disparities all of a sudden are being exacerbated by a rampant pandemic. So I've just become a lot more passionate about community engagement and impact on a broad scale beyond education. But it's all part of this ongoing evolution of that fundamental recognition that started when I was in high school, I think.
One thing I want to highlight for folks listening is how, one, there was a defining moment or from where you made a big shift from I want to study engineering to maybe engineering is not for me. Here's the thing that I think I'm interested in. But it wasn't just that moment and then you're done. Like you never reflected again. It was, this is the direction that I think I'm going to go. Let's follow that path and continue reflecting and continue iterating and continue refining exactly what is it that I am most curious about and interested in, and how I can best make my impact with respect to the vision and the purpose that I have in the world. So I wanted to highlight that because I think a lot of people have the misconception that you have this one moment in your life and then everything clicks and it's smooth sailing from there. You don't have to change anything. But the reality, similar to my story, is very much like your story. It's an iterative process. It's a process of constant reflection and trying to orient yourself such that you're most attuned to what you're hearing inside of yourself from about whether you're interested in the stuff that you're doing, what makes you feel energetic, what makes you feel come alive, but also about new information that you're taking in about what are the different means that I can make an impact in the world. And I know that's something that you mentioned that your time as a Rhodes Scholar kind of changed your mind about a little bit. I'll get into that in a moment. But the one thing I wanted to bring up is, so you're someone who's gotten into Princeton University for undergrad. You went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar for one of your master's degrees. And then now you're going to be doing a JD at Yale School of Law and an MBA at Harvard. I think I know a lot of people who would just want one of those degrees and be like, yep, that's it. You're going after all four of them and you got accepted into all four of them. And I had this question down as something that I thought you might be interested in discussing, but now that I see you're really interested in persuasion and persuasive writing, I definitely want to ask it. And that is, what are some of your secrets to writing good applications and to writing these good persuasive applications to get you accepted? Are there any techniques that you found useful? Are there any frameworks that you can recommend to listeners? Because I know even from my brief time in the nonprofit world from my first startup, Zio, writing and persuasive writing is a fact of life in these kinds of industries. And so I'm curious about what advice would you give to people in terms of writing these good applications that you've clearly had a lot of success with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to take a step back and say, when I say I'm interested in persuasion, it just sounds so cunning and deceitful. It just sounds really sleazy and sly fox. I think that back then it was like, that's how I understood it, just because what do you do in high school? Like you write persuasive essays. I would say now that's really evolved to just have a fascination with rhetoric, especially like oratory and some of the great orators of history. Like I'm that nerd who will like actually go back and listen to Winston Churchill speeches and Abraham Lincoln speeches and JFK speeches because it fascinates me. And again, I think that we're blessed to have had a very clear orator of history in Obama in our era that we constantly get to hear him speak, but I'm biased. But anyway, all of that is to say, I think that now that's evolved such that it's really a passion for writing. in general. It's not so much like persuasive writing, so much as just if you just look at my phone and like the reflections that I write. I've recently started to try to get more into journaling so that it's a little bit more structured. But sometimes, like when things just come to me, I just need to write it down because I just love to write. And I'm also that person who just loves to learn. Like I actually go back from time to time just to make sure I'm staying sharp on punctuation and like different vocab that I'm trying to pick up. So it's kind of like this fashion with the process of writing in general. What that fascination with writing has done is when you mix that passion that I have for writing and that devotion that I have for learning the craft and studying it intensively with this other sensibility that I've cultivated in understanding people, while also at the same time trying to improve myself to better understand people, it allows me to craft narratives very well because I have a deep understanding of myself at the same time that I understand the stories of others from just repeated engagement with them and a deep investment and interest in learning more about them. And then you put that with the fact that just generally I like to write and I feel like I can write quite well. And you get what is one of the strongest things that you can possibly have in an application, which is the ability to develop a compelling and well-written, well-crafted personal statement. Now, all of that is to say, I'm not saying I'm the best thing since sliced bread. I'm not trying to create this impression of I got into 4 schools because like I was made to write applications. Like not at all. I think that it's just a matter of learning how to write a personal statement. And that's why I love to help people as they're going through the application process, because I do think that although at first this concept of writing about yourself seems really intimidating and it's inherently unusual process. Like we're generally not programmed to all of a sudden just freely share the deepest intricacies of our private lives like that, and especially not to do it in an academic tone, right? Usually if we're going to do, we're going to do it in a journalistic sense. So I think it's off-putting and intimidating and uncomfortable, but once you learn it, and it is a learnable skill, that I think for the most part is one of the most fundamental and beneficial keys to having success in an application process. Of course, after that is you're going to have to get the test scores, you're going to have to get the GPA and things like that. But even the test scores, this is like almost like its own podcast, but I felt like what always served me well in test scores is that same process of building habits and knowing how to plan and managing your time that we talked about earlier. I just applied to the concept of test taking. Now, I'm this person, I call myself the test masochist, if you will, because I essentially took the LSAT and the GRE within a calendar year of each other. I took the LSAT in September of 2018 and then flipped around and took the GRE in September of 2019 because after having already gotten into law school, all of these thoughts that we had talked a bit about around the role of the private sector in community development and the importance of activating nonprofit engagement and grassroots movements as well, I recognize it's not just law. I need to get this tri-sector kind of cross-sector collaboration work in. I applied to business school. And what I learned when I was applying for LSAT, when I was applying for GRE, is that I needed to become really key at structuring my practice. If I knew that I was going to have 3 months from now until test day, I better know what material I'm covering this week and that week. I better know when I'm taking this practice test and that practice test and how many practice tests I need to take before this day and what score I want to hope to be trying to achieve by this point and that point. Like I need to set checkpoints and markers by which I can measure my progress on the test. What I did was I tried to, in every facet of the application, just become as robust as possible in making sure that there were no questions around, oh, like Jordan has an incredible story and look at how beautifully he writes about it, but oh my gosh, like those test scores, I didn't want anybody to feel like they were doing me a favor. I wanted to be really undeniable in every facet of what I was applying with. But I will always go back to, again, test scores are great, GPA is great, and that stuff you can coach around it. There's also a lot of inequity and inequality in the process where sometimes you just don't have money to do a prep course or whatever. I can wax poetic around tests taking and things like that. But I always go back to like really what I think the key to my success was in applying to these schools was twofold. One, like I said, I had a really deep understanding of self, enough to be able to actually craft my narrative and articulate a vision for the school. But then two, it was the vision. And it was being able to know firmly and then communicate why it made sense to even go to that school. Like I know people, they'll look at this, they say, Princeton, Oxford, Harvard, Yale, what are you doing? You're just collecting degrees? It's no, like I actually have a coherent and compelling and cogent set of reasons and a very robust thought process behind why I apply to every one of those schools. And I know exactly, I can tell you what I'm trying to get out of the JD MBA, right? And once you have vision, and again, just goes back to what we talked about with purpose. But once you have that vision, you have that purpose, and you have your why for why you're applying to a school, that makes your process for now telling your story in the context of that why so much easier. I think that's what makes a good personal statement. I'm not just telling you my story, but I'm telling you my story in the context of because I lived this and because this is who I am and this is what I've experienced and endured and how I understand the world. This is why it makes sense for me to go to this school. This is the vision. Like this is the missing piece. You putting a bet on me, right? Because that's what a school is doing when they admit you. They're basically placing a bet on you that you're going to go to their school. You're going to be able to integrate into their student body to serve their community as an engaged member of the student body, and also to just be able to manage yourself academically, and then hopefully go out and be a proud alumni of that school. They're placing a bet. That's who you are, that you are who you say you are. And to the extent that they're placing that bet, you need to be able to articulate a vision that they can bet on, as this is who I am. And this is why going to the school is just going to make me even better. This is what I'm going to do by nature of being there. And I always had that. I started with the vision. I didn't wake up one day and I said, I want to go to Harvard. Let me go figure out why. I knew my why. And it was like, it kept me up at night figuring out how in the world do I do what I need to do in this world? How do I go out and be the person that I want to be? How do I serve my community? How do I go out and serve a public purpose? How do I just try to make an impact? How do I try to make people's lives better? And I realized like, I can't do that as effectively as I would like to, but for attending Yale Law. And then later, as I started to learn more about community impact and just how I needed to serve, I was like, I can't do that, but for also doing the MBA. And then I was able to articulate why I want to do a JD MBA. But again, that's what made it undeniable now, is because I have a why. And I can tell you, as you're interviewing me as a Harvard MBA admissions officer, this is why I need to go to your school. You see, I know exactly what it is about going to Harvard that's going to allow me to make a positive difference in this world. And I know that not everybody has an impact focused case for their why. So I don't want to orient our entire conversation. Like some people legitimately just want to go to HBS or YLS or whatever, because they want to make a career pivot and they just want to go into the corporate sector. And I don't want to career bash anybody. Like if that's your vision, fine. But I think that the fundamental principle that I'm articulating here, and I'll stop, is whatever that why is for you, you need to know it clearly, and it needs to be then cogently articulated and communicated in your personal statement in the context of you, though. Like you're not just saying, Harvard's great. Let me tell you why it's great. It's no, Harvard's great. And here's why I understand it to be great, because let me tell you a little bit about myself. Let me tell you my story. And then here's where the two converge. And that has always been, I think, the key to how I was able to just have this success that I did in applying for these programs, is because for the most part, in the current day and age, perhaps more so than ever, programs are placing bets on people with purpose and with vision, and who understand inherently and intuitively how the programs offered at their schools are going to enhance and facilitate and capacitate that vision.
I love the fact that when you apply to these schools, your advice essentially is don't go and say, I want to go to Harvard, and then figure out, why do I actually want to go to Harvard? I love how you approach it, where you say, look, this is my vision. This is my purpose in life. This is the impact that I want to make in the world. And this is why this is a necessary step for me going to school X, Y, and Z. And that's going to help me achieve my mission in the world and actually have the impact that I want. So just to summarize for folks at home, start with your vision and your purpose, figure out how that school fits into that, and how you're going to both contribute from the school, but also, or contribute to the school rather. As you said, they're going to imagine you. Can you imagine this person on our campus? What are they going to be partaking in? What sort of clubs, what sort of things are they going to be contributing to student life? But then also, how are they going to take the experience that they had over here and then use that to make an impact into the world? I really love the way you articulated that, and how the why features so prominently in there. Simon Sinek has this book, Start With Why. That really, again, becomes a filter for everything that you do if you have a clear purpose, you can then better articulate what is it that you need to do in order to achieve that. And you're not going to be struggling to try and figure out, I know this is a good school, but like, why would they accept me? I'm not good enough. Try and be more proactive than that. So thank you for sharing that.
I do want to give one example for that, because I know that we have a diverse listener base here, viewer base here, and not everybody's applying to school. So it's, but I think that the concept of finding your why applies to anything that you said. It's the inherent thing that gets you going. It's the thing that makes you tick, in that in the most challenging moments, in the most despairing moments where you just don't feel like doing it anymore, all of a sudden you remember that why and you're summoned to the cause. So just one great example of that I tell people is like, this is taking souls, right? So I reached April/May of senior year at Princeton, spring of 2018. And I'm starting to think a lot more at this point. I'd already committed to law school, but I'm starting to get involved already in some of that community development, economic development, job creation type work, social impact investing, and like venture philanthropy work in the city of Newark. Already I was starting to dip my feet in it. And I'm starting to see already the essence of, I may want to consider actually doing a JD MBA, but now they won't take my LSAT. I can only do the GRE. Here's the thing though, the GRE is an online test. The LSAT was a written test. And to this point, shocks a lot of people, but to this point, I was pretty much like a hunt and peck typer at Princeton. I was probably the fastest two-finger typer you ever saw, but I was a two-finger typer. Like, I never actually learned how to properly type. And so it was a source of concern. I wouldn't say like insecurity. Like, I didn't care. For me personally, like, I'll hunt and peck all day, but it was a source of concern going into the GRE, where I knew I was going to have to write 2 essays, 30 minutes each, to a degree and to a length that would be pretty much unfeasible if I were to hunt and peck. Like, I was going to have to learn how to properly type and get my speed up. So now we're sitting at May, and I basically got 3 to 4 months before I take this test, and I can't take the test as I'm currently constructed. I don't have the toolkit. I don't have the skill set. I don't know how to properly type. I say, I'm going to learn. And I got a typing program online. There's this one called Typesy that I felt was the best for the price. It's quite affordable. It takes you from soup to nuts, every single thing that you need to know how to touch type properly. And I set a goal for increasing my typing speed enough to be able to write essays within 30 minutes. And I spent that summer just painstakingly setting time aside each day to relearn as a 20-year-old, 21-year-old person at this point, the 21 at this point, relearn how to type. And that thing is just, it's one of those examples of, was it inherently frustrating? Yeah, I had to unlearn however long I had been typing since I was a kid. Probably I was like 4 or 5 when I first started typing on a keyboard. I had to learn like all of those years. I had to unlearn all of those years and learn a completely new method. What kept me going? I'd stop and I'd say, why am I actually even doing this? And I remember there is a GRE that is coming up in just 3 or 4 months. And I got 2 options. I relearn how to type or I don't. Either way, that GRE is coming. And when I sit down and take that GRE, I will never forgive myself if the reason why I don't perform on that test is because I didn't know how to touch type. So it actually, I got one option, and that's to relearn. But that's because I knew my why. I knew why I was doing it. And I also had a timeline for achieving that goal. I knew I had about 3 or 4 months. And there's nothing that will get you motivated like that why and that deadline for accomplishing the why.
It reminds me of, and it's so funny that you bring up increasing your speed as some sort of component task for a test. When I was actually preparing for the SATs, and of course, I was in school in Costa Rica at this time, we didn't have any test prep. We had one book that we would pass around, myself and the fellow African students. We would just share this book that one of our elder students gave to us that they used to prepare for the test. And we would just read it and follow the instructions and stuff like that. And one of the things I realized, very similar to you, is that the reading section of the SAT, like, I'm always running out of time. Like, I'm not getting through the whole thing. And so I was like, why don't I teach myself how to speed read? So I picked up this book. I think I went to the bookstore at the mall in Santa Ana in Costa Rica. And I found a book on learning how to speed read. And that kind of spring break, I spent time learning the different techniques, trying to figure out how I'm going to apply it. But I had a very specific goal for why I wanted to do it. In your case, you're not just learning the skill to learn the skill, you're learning it to apply it in the context of doing better at your GRE. Very similar with me. I wanted to do better at the SAT. I wanted to not stress as much and make sure that I could finish everything in time. And I think that's 2 good examples, funnily enough, or in our lives, that very similar things that happen, but also how if you have a application or if you have a end goal that you want to reach, you'll be able to pick up the skills that are required a lot more easily. People ask me all the time, Avthar, programming is so important. How can I learn how to program? How can I learn how to write code and stuff like that? And the answer that I've settled on now after a lot of thinking is using programming to solve a problem that you have. Because if you understand the context of the problem, whatever tools you need, you'll pick it up because you're the pain of the problem that you're trying to solve. Wonderful that this principle has manifested itself in your life again. There's so much that we've chatted about. The time has flown by. I do want to chat about something that we said that we want to talk about in the beginning of this podcast. I had some questions about themes in your life and your work with Ray Chambers and John Simon, which maybe we can save for a future episode because it's impossible to cover everything in just a couple of hours. But one thing that I did want to explore is contrasting our respective paths in life. You've taken a path where it's focused on the public sector, public service, private-public collaboration, and focusing on solving, again, these societal issues, as you mentioned, inequality, injustice, social mobility, education. Whereas myself, I've taken the path of using entrepreneurship and business as the best way to make an impact into the world. Funnily enough, I still care about a lot of the same problems that you care about, things like solving inequality in the world, solving education, but my specific lens is through technology. And I wanted to highlight that what this demonstrates is that whatever path other people take in the world, there are many paths to greatness, and you've got to choose the one that's most suited to you and your natural skills and your natural interests. Ultimately, there's many ways to live a good life. But I did want to dig into some of the pros and cons or some of the things that you've learned about why did you choose a specific path, just to provide some value for our listeners who are maybe young people trying to figure out, there's so many things that I could do in the world. What are the different avenues that I can take? Why is it that you found that the public sector and focusing on policy and now public-private collaboration is the thing that is best for you? And what do you see as some pros and cons of being in this sector that people should be aware of? And then I can do the same for technology and business.
I'd say how I got involved in it was, like I said, it was compounding. So it really just started with being really involved in education. And I think that this is just generally how careers progress, is you start to build a foundation. And then I really like the concept of broadening your range of applications and responsibilities as you progressively learn more about your field and become better at your field. So at first, it was really just education and becoming the best education policy reformer and advocate that I can be. And like I said, that was really cultivated and then catapulted by my time on the Newark Public Schools Board. So it started with education policy. And then it was when I got introduced to Ray and I started learning a lot about the philanthropic engagements that he was involved in the city of Newark. And it started really embracing that concept of a Newark Renaissance and the revitalization that I was telling you about that was so focused on tech development and business attraction, job creation, starting to think really creatively about equitable real estate development and trying. One thing that I've been enthused about in the city of Newark is that we are thinking quite progressively about gentrification and thinking a lot about affordable housing and things like that. Everything from housing policy to food support to education to health to just mentorship and business, all of it was starting to come together. And I wanted to understand, what is a city? What is a community? Like, what are actually the essential pillars that make a city? And that's when as you start unpacking it, you start seeing, okay, there's a business sector, there's a downtown, there's a commercial aspect to what makes a city run. Then, of course, you have all of your grassroots, that's your nonprofit programs on the ground that are actually giving services to community residents. Okay, who are those residents? Now you start looking into the demographics. You start seeing, okay, what are some of the social problems that plague those demographics, whether that's homelessness, that's some of the language issues that come around your immigrant population, or just like the general other struggles that come around immigrant population. So all of this stuff starts getting really interconnected. And I just fell in love with the interconnectedness of the city ecosystem, where everything from what the business community is doing to then what the nonprofit community is doing to then what the city administration is doing. So that's where the public sector stuff comes in to actually improve conditions broadly, whatever those gaps are. I mentioned some of them, like how we think about it from a Greenlight perspective, whether it's kindergarten reading level that's staggering behind, or you look at the crime rate in the city, or you look at absenteeism among students, like whatever some of those problematic metrics are. And I love data because I think that you really need to have data to be able to understand. There are things that you can't measure, but to the extent that you can measure it, it's perfect because then you have a good starting point. You can track it, you can follow based on an intervention how it's improving after you started offering services to it. So I really like looking at metrics. And once you look at some of those key plaguing, problematic, lagging behind metrics in a city, and you start unpacking what it takes to improve them, you start seeing all of the ways that it's okay. We could have the public sector get involved, right? Like the mayor and the city council could pass this executive order or this legislative bill that might help. Or there's literally trillions of dollars in the private sector nationally. If you were to just activate a minutia of those private sector resources for just pure social good, which is why so many companies have corporate social responsibility arms now, just think about the impact that they can have. So I'm a huge advocate for purpose-driven business and activating the power of those resources. I don't think that they do enough, but that's a topic for another call. And then you start looking at obviously the nonprofits that are already, they only exist for a social purpose. So they're already doing their part. But the point is, like, as I understood and I fell in love with the interconnectedness of a city, and I started really getting into, okay, this is what bothers me about what's happening in education. This is what bothers me about what's happening in crime, et cetera. What do I need to do to fix it? I just started understanding that you could maybe take one angle, but you're so much stronger when you start understanding the ways that they actually relate to each other, and that when they work in collaboration, you achieve an even better goal. So an example of that is, just quickly here, the New Jersey Pandemic Relief Fund was a nonprofit fund distribution entity that we set up in collaboration with a variety of business partners, a couple of nonprofits in the state of New Jersey, and with the First Lady Tammy Murphy's office and the governor's office. And so we pulled resources from the public sector and private sector and built this entity that was devoted to then marshaling those resources and administering them to the groups, generally nonprofits across the state, that were most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the early days of the pandemic. So a lot of them went to food pantries and community foundations and things like that, city foundations. So that's just a perfect example of when you get the business community coming together with the government, the regnant government, and then you start getting nonprofits involved to help with distribution and on the ground service provision, it's a win all around. You get the resource of the private sector, the administrative coordinating power of the public sector, and some of the legislative support to the extent that it's necessary. And then you get the service provision and like just pure unparalleled community knowledge of the nonprofit sector. And that's a home run. And so that's where I fell in love with it. And that's when I realized that's my niche. Like, just the fact that I can talk about it this passionately and most people just don't even care. It's, what is a city? It's a place where I live. Like, the fact that I care about it that much, that's when I knew it was my thing.
What are some of the challenges that you faced that make it difficult to make an impact through the vehicles that you've chosen? As you mentioned, public policy, grassroots movements, nonprofits, and the public-private collaboration. Just to paint a picture for the listeners at home, because I think that in at least countries where, at least I'm from South Africa, government, and even in the US, nowhere is perfect in terms of how the government works. And so I'm curious, just to paint a picture for folks at home. We've talked a lot about how it can be so fulfilling, how it's so purpose-driven, how you get to see things from a very holistic point of view. And obviously, it's very suited to your personal interests and strengths. But I'm curious about the challenges that you face and you're trying to overcome in order to try and make that impact that actually makes things a little bit difficult with the path that you've chosen to go down.
Yeah, it could be really difficult when you're engaged with all of those parties to make a project come together. These are generally quite large, ambitious projects whenever you get a public-private collaboration, and then especially when you start looping in the nonprofits on the ground to help with service provision and things like that. I think that sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good when you're working on a tri-sector project, and it can be difficult to get it off the ground. I think that there are also just resource constraints that you run into sometimes where, like, the private sector might have all the resources that they need to devote this thing, but then all of a sudden they'll tell you that it wasn't in their corporate social responsibility budget, so we can't do it in this year. We're gonna have to circle back after this year's funds have been allocated. We'll check it next year. So then you have to go to the public sector, and they probably already have their budgets allocated. As much as you would really hope that's usually not the issue, usually it all comes. And I can't tell you how much of this community development work, it really revolves around trying to figure out who's paying for it and where the money's coming from. So that gets a little frustrated when there's an extravagant project, really impactful project that could make a really key difference for a certain group or a segment of the city. And then, like, you just can't get it off the ground because there isn't the funding for it. So funding, I would say is usually the largest constraint that I face. And I can't tell you how much of my job usually involves thinking about it. The other challenge is it's emotionally draining to an extent because I'm, especially now with COVID-19, where I'm doing so much work on the COVID response, thinking about setting up new testing sites, thinking about helping with vaccine deployment and vaccine logistics, thinking about mass distribution. I draft reports every week for Ray and then working with the city on analyzing the data reports on what the transmission rate and the case positivity rate is in the city. And it hurts my heart sometimes as a resident of the city to see these staggering numbers. We were in a really great place. And I have to say, we've done a phenomenal job in the city of Newark at rolling out a really robust public health response to this virus with contact tracing, testing, offering care coordination efforts for those who need to quarantine at home, et cetera. So we have the pillars in place. But then you look at the demographics of a place like where I grew up in the East Ward of Newark, that is largely Portuguese and Latinx, a large proportion of essential workers who just can't afford to stay home. And that sets the conditions for what we've observed really since November, which is a positivity rate in that neighborhood at its peak, 43% positivity rate in that part of the city. It was making national headlines for 5 days straight. And you look at that and you have to remember that those aren't just numbers, right? Those are people whose livelihoods are being directly impacted by nature of now having this virus, who may be sitting at home just not even knowing if their loved one, right? If they're going to survive, or if they tested positive themselves, who may be suffering, who may be in a hospital. So it's emotionally draining work. And that's a COVID example of it. But putting COVID aside, when you're involved in education policy and you recognize that like the work that you're doing could very, very fundamentally alter the pathways to opportunity for however many students are in that school or are in that school district. And think about your personal educational journey and if the policies and the structure wasn't in place for you because a group, for instance, hadn't put in place that structure, your life would have been different. So we really are talking about changing lives and in COVID's case, saving lives. So it could just be really emotionally draining work and you get really invested. You work long hours, not because you're always required to, but because it's how can I justify not working a little longer when like I can literally change or save a life.
I think that all the quote unquote drawbacks of pursuing this path are all solvable problems in a way. Hopefully the resource issue can get solved as we move to more collaboration with aligning capital and allocating capital more efficiently towards causes that are worth supporting. And then, as you say, more awareness now with self-care and making sure that the people who are doing these kinds of emotionally draining work are taking care of themselves at the end of the day, because that's how you make the best impact. Thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people learned and got much more of an insight into what it's actually like to take the path that you've chosen for yourself. I do want to mention just 3 quick things that I wrote down just to give my perspective of things, of what it's like to go down the route of entrepreneurship and business and technology. I think the 3 main reasons that I chose this path: 1, scale. So first of all, you can make something that has an impact on millions of people in the world right from your bedroom. And the fact that you can now, for example, I'm making this podcast, and through leveraging the internet and through leveraging media in this case, it can reach people in South Africa, it can reach people in Newark, it can reach people in Costa Rica. The fact that when you work on these kinds of things, it actually allows you to impact people all over the world. That's one of the major things that drew me to it. The other one is this idea of efficient impact, meaning that the size of the firm has actually shrunk for you to actually get something off the ground. Previously, you needed millions of dollars and dozens of people in order to start a business, whereas now you maybe need 2 or 3 people and a much less amount of money in order to build something, at least using software that can actually help people and impact their lives. And so I think, coming from a perspective where I'm often thinking, similarly, from a grassroots perspective, what is the change that I can make in the world? What is the problem that I can solve? And what can I do with the most menial of resources? That really appealed to me, to know that, hey, something that I can do can actually have this impact. And I don't need to wait for the approval of these dozens of other people and go through down all these other bureaucracy that is unfortunately part of the systems in many places. And then the third part is this idea of positive sum wealth creation, to know that obviously there's going to be investors and there's going to be venture capital trying to make money off the tech industry and off business. But I think that ultimately, you can build something, and by you pursuing profit in the case of business, you can actually, as you mentioned earlier, increase and uplift all the boats of trying to create a positive some impact in the world. Just because you're trying to make something better doesn't necessarily mean that something has to be worse, so that you have to commit all sorts of violations and something like that. Unfortunately, these things do go unchecked. That's why you have things like labor laws and all these other environmental responsibilities and stuff like that. So I do think that there is a place, obviously, for policy to come and check these things. But I think where a lot of people can get bogged down is in the pursuit of greed and in the pursuit of the shiny new thing syndrome, where there's always new things coming out. There's always this new thing that's going to change the world. And sometimes it's difficult to pick a problem and to pick something and say, okay, I'm just going to iterate on this. I'm just going to work on this and try and make progress, rather than chase the next big thing that's going to supposedly make everything better and solve all the problems. And I think the other thing is ego and the change that you're making. You interact with a lot of people who are using this pursuit of business and technology to try and elevate themselves in their own mind. And as a startup founder, I've been through the whole thing. You think you're trying to change the world. You think that you're going to make this big impact. And so you have to be very careful about the impact that has on you. And then lastly, making sure that you're using your skills for good. As Spider-Man's uncle said, with great power comes great responsibility. And you see these days tech being used for a lot of nefarious ends, data tracking and malware and all this kind of stuff. And you, at the end of the day, there's an ethical responsibility there to try and use it for good. So that's just my end of the story. I want to wrap up with some quickfire questions, and then we'll let our listeners know where they can find you online. There's so much that we talked about, and I feel like I just want to end off with some little pithy things of wisdom that people can take away. So the first question is, this podcast is called Learn with Avthar. So I'm curious, what's something that you've learned recently?
I've been really going deep into Spanish study, actually. So I would say I've learned how to speak and write in Spanish has been the biggest one. And the reason for that is because we didn't get too much into it on this podcast, but I did mention earlier that I am, since birth, really connected to my Portuguese heritage. And Spanish and Portuguese are quite similar languages. I grew up really close to the Hispanic community in Newark, and so it's just always been a desire of mine to finally learn Spanish. And now that I'm working and won't be in school for at least another few months, it just seemed like a right time to finally pick up Spanish studies. So if anybody who does reach out to me after this has any more tips for fun ways to continue engaging with Spanish music, Spanish food, etc., I will fully take it.
I love it. The next question is, what book or books have impacted you the most?
I would say Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins is definitely up there. It's definitely one that really mattered. The other one, who I know you're also a fan of this one, is Design Your Life by the two Stanford professors. Their names are escaping me now. I think one's name might be Dave Barnett might be one. Essentially, it shows you how to apply design thinking and architectural principles, etc., to your life, and actually how to then craft a pathway that is intentional and personally curated. So great book. I read that one when I was in college, and it really helped frame how I was thinking about grad school, work life, etc. Beyond that, there are just some works of fiction that I really enjoyed. I think back to reading 1984. It was a pretty transformative book and an insightful moment when I read that one. More tangible stuff is, I like to just pick up exchange books. So this isn't like one particular book. I'm just going to say this concept, which I'd recommend to anybody, is just exchanging books. So I recently got this book right here. It's hard to see with my background, but this is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, who was one of the Roman emperors. And I haven't gotten too deep into it yet. It's some of his reflections on leadership and the process of being in charge of the Roman Empire. But it was sent to me from one of my really good friends who's over at Stanford Law School. And I would recommend to anybody, if you're passionate about learning something and then holding yourself accountable to just continuous personal self-development, find a buddy, find a partner who is equally passionate about that as you, and you send them a book and they send you a book. And that's worked really well for me.
Love it. The authors of the book that you mentioned were Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, two professors at Stanford Design School, Designing Your Life. We'll put a link in the show notes for everyone to check out the books that you mentioned. And I love that idea of like book exchange with people that you on that learning journey with, because that's how you discover these new things and see things from different perspectives. So I definitely think that's something that people can practice at home. The other question that I wanted to ask is, when you hear the word successful, who's the first person that comes to mind?
I think about the gentleman who I'm working for now, Ray Chambers, and I don't think about it for the reasons that some people may think. So some people would define his success by what he managed to accomplish when he really was one of the top individuals on Wall Street through what he was doing with his private equity firm. I attribute his success, or let me say not attribute his success, but I conceptualize his success in terms of what he's done since he retired from that work and turned over to full-time philanthropy. When you talk to him about what motivated that period, when you talk to others and they still hold him up as one of the legendary figures in the industry, somebody who developed tactics in investing that still are being used by investors across the country. They basically become textbook, but he invented them. So they say he retired in his Jordan days, basically in the 90s when Jordan was just winning championship after championship. This was him. And then just like Jordan, he just retired. And you talk to him about why. And he said, I wasn't fully happy. I wasn't satisfied. He said that I could have kept doing that work. And he said, I could have gone on a path to try to become a billionaire. And he said, I would have never been happy doing that. He said, the happiest that I was when I was working with the Boys and Girls Club of Newark. And he said, when I recognized, that's when I knew it was time to leave that other world behind. And it was time to start living a different life. And now you think about how this man lives, and his life's work revolves around giving away the wealth that he spent decades building because he's passionate about it and he think it matters, and he's constantly involved in ever present process of trying to learn more about how he can help. He's very big into mindfulness and meditation. So he wakes up every morning and he asks himself, how can I help somebody today? Who can I help today? And then he goes out and he does it. And I just think about that success, that when you reach a point in your life where you're in a place where you can truly make a difference in people's lives and you're intentionally going about every single day, and essentially you've crafted a life around the things that give you energy. This is what he loves. So he gets to just basically, it's not work for him anymore. Every single day he wakes up, he does what he loves, and he gets to fundamentally change people's lives along the process of doing what he loves. That to me, just for so many reasons that we've already talked about on this podcast and how I view my life, that is success. It's not the money that he made. Obviously, the money helps him to live this life now. But I would say the same for anybody who's in any income bracket, who just finds himself in a position where every day they get out of bed, they do what they love, and in the process of doing what they love, they are helping other people. They are making a difference in other people's lives. Other people, when all is said and done, they're no longer doing that work because they can't or whatever happens. I think a lot about legacy. And to me, the most successful legacy stories are those where no matter who you ask, that person will say, that person was just phenomenal. That person changed my life. That person did X for me. That person inspired me in this way. That to me is a successful person. When your legacy is outward facing and it's not, oh, they built this company, they did that. But no, it's like that person inspired me in this way. Let me tell you about that time where it was 1 o'clock in the morning. I didn't know where to turn. My life was in shambles, and they were the first person I called. That's success. That when you're that first line of contact, because that person knows that you care and that you can help, that's success.
I couldn't agree more. I think that theme of service and being helpful and contributing to others, ultimately money is just a means to an end to do that. Look at all the people who have made vast sums of money in the world. They end up giving it away because they realize that the fulfillment that they were looking for in the riches and in the wealth can't be found through that. And so ultimately it leads them to these other paths. One of the questions I wanted to ask to close up is, before that, you mentioned earlier that you listened to speeches and you revisit some of the speeches that you found very influential. What are your favorite one or two or three speeches that you found to be, really impactful on your life?
That's a good one. I really like Obama's inauguration speech, 2008, when he first won, because that was, for me, it was the earliest moment that I can remember hearing Obama speak. So I really like Obama's initial inauguration speech. I still like to go back to the Gettysburg Address. Now, it's not sort of present or contemporary anymore, so that's not really why I go back to it. But I think that just from an oratory perspective, the leadership that Abraham Lincoln expressed and commanded when he was giving the address, and then the historical implications of it, as somebody who's like really passionate about African American history and all that the Civil War implicated, is really fascinating to me. So I would put that one up there. And then think of a third one. The third one, I'm going to put a category because it's one of my favorite groups that I like to listen to on Spotify or on YouTube Music that I have to give a shout out to is Fearless Motivation. In fact, I'll give you two. There's Fearless Motivation, and then I think the other one on YouTube is called like Goalpost, I think might be it, or Goalcast.
Goalcast, yeah.
Goalcast.
Yeah.
If you look
Yeah.
at those, I'm like always on Goalcast, or I'm always on Fearless Motivation. I would say like the whole collection of speeches under there. There's this one by Walter Bonds. I'm just going to throw one out there. He talks about the next level. Listen to the Next Level by Walter Bonds, and or like Next Level Mindset might be what it's called. And that's just like a perfect example of some of the content that Fearless Motivation puts out. It's almost impossible to listen to that and not feel incredibly inspired to just go out and want to take every ounce of every day and fully commit it to being a better version of yourself. So those are my three. I cheated, I know, but I'm going to say Obama's inauguration speech for kind of personal impact. I'm going to say Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address for oratory brilliance combined with historical relevance. And then I'm going to say just anything that Fearless Motivation and Goalcast puts out is usually just pretty high quality content.
I certainly know what I'm going to be listening to in the next week. So thank you for those recommendations. I wanted to end this podcast on a question that I think is relevant for many people our age, especially folks that, like you and I, are trying to make a difference in the world, trying to make an impact, and we're working very hard every day. And so the question is, how do you balance the quest for achievement with the desire for fulfillment in life?
I would say when you reach a point where they're no longer in tension with each other or in conflict with each other, it makes it a lot easier. So for me, this quest for achievement is firmly driven by what I deem to be my source of fulfillment. So when you think about what people now attribute to me and associate with me as being my, to this point, crowning, defining achievements. So going to Princeton and Oxford, and now having gotten into Yale and Harvard, and people look at this, the big four, and they say, that's incredible. And they say, well, how did you achieve that? And I talk about it is just like we already talked about this earlier. I always start with like why I even wanted to go, as crazy as it may sound. And it's because I really believe that that was the most effective, most viable pathway for me to actually impact and improve communities the way that I wanted to in the world. I talk a lot about communities because that's the type of work that I do, but I do want to also be clear that I'm really passionate about just like general national issues and global issues. And a lot of my work entails that as well, even though we haven't talked about it as much. But the point is, for me, my goals are set, my achievements are pursued, all in relation to what I believe is going to bring me fulfillment and ultimately allow me to achieve my broader kind of life mission. And I think that when you reach a place where those converge and they don't seem like they're in constant conflict. I know like for a lot of people, what you're achieving right now is because it's going to advance you up the corporate ladder or something. And that just seems a little empty to you because it's not really fundamentally linked to like the things you like doing. And I feel like that it just goes back to what you said, Avthar, about that's when you hear a lot of people who end up accruing vast amounts of wealth, all of a sudden just stopping and saying, like, I don't want to do this anymore because they're not happy. So I feel like happiness comes at a point where all of a sudden what you're doing for work no longer is in conflict with what you want to do for a living. And it's hard, but I think that it comes to those who really diligently and intentionally pursue it. And when you finally get there, it's really liberating.
I love it. So you would say your answer is all about aligning the things that bring you fulfillment and to try and orient your achievement. Because I think everyone has to go to work every day. We all have to, kids have to go to school and stuff like that. But if you can align those two, you'll no longer be feeling that internal tension. I think that's really wonderful advice. Jordan, this has been a really inspiring 2+ hours, and I'm suddenly leaving motivated to make an impact in the world and bring even more intensity and energy to the work that I'm doing. So thank you so much for making time. I know you're super busy, and I'm sure you've inspired a ton of people just by being on this podcast and sharing your truth. If people want to keep up with you, where can they find you online?
Twitter and Instagram at Real Afro Scholar. So Real AFRO Scholar. And I would say I'm pretty active on there. So if anybody wants to keep the conversation going, please send me a direct message. And I'm always happy to talk about this stuff because I'm so passionate about anything that we talked about, especially like the grad school stuff. I know a lot of people are going through the process, and I'm always keen to just try to help and share whatever tips. This was not the space for that because it's a whole nother conversation around just grad school applications, but I know it's a big interest of people. So if they reach out to me at Real Afro Scholar, whether because they just want to stay in touch and follow each other's journey, support each other along this journey of life, or because they have any questions or anything, I'm more than happy to get in touch with them.
Fantastic. Definitely give Jordan a follow on those platforms. I'll be putting a link in the show notes for people to do that. And that's it for today's podcast. I hope you have learned a lot. I know I certainly have. And thank you so much again, Jordan Thomas.
Thank you, Avthar. This has been an awesome podcast, as they always are. So really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Learn with Avthar. I really do hope you've enjoyed it. If you've learned something from this episode, please subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, or just tell your friends and family about this new interesting podcast you've discovered called Learn with Avthar. I want to show you one quick thing before you go. If those of you on YouTube, be able to see it on the screen. If not, audio, I'll describe it and you'll listen to it later. You can go watch it on YouTube channel Avthar Surathan. But I just wanted to show you something in case you're not aware of it. If I can find my share screen button. All right, what I wanted to show you was this. It's called Avthar's Weekly Wisdom. And every week I write a newsletter where I share practical wisdom about self-mastery, startups and investing and business, as well as health and happiness. My guarantee is that you'll discover one thing that can change your life every week. The newsletter is called Avthar's Weekly Wisdom. You can check it out here. You can see I talk about topics, sharing the podcasts that I found most interesting, essays that I've written. You'll also get the first releases of podcasts new podcasts that I release. And you'll also find things like my essential reading list for 2021 and my favorite annual review questions. These are just some of the articles that I've released in the past couple of weeks. So if you like it, go and check it out at avthar.com. That's avthar.com. Put in your email address there, and you'll start receiving new newsletter editions every Sunday. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you on another episode of Learn with Avthar very, very soon.